The Bees, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Being a reporter for a local newspaper is a strange occupation. In essence, it's exactly the same as being a reporter for a major news organization. I mean, the actual processes are the same. You find a story, you interview those involved or closest to the story, and then you find a way to present the facts to the public in a factual and, if possible, entertaining way. The practicalities of the task are the same. The difference is the stories. Most stories you cover in the local newspaper are boring. If they weren't, then they wouldn't be in the local newspaper in the first place. They'd be in the nationals. At a major newspaper, stories are like planets. They have satellites. Other smaller stories that circulate around the main thread. In the trade, we call this soft news, the finer detail stories that come with a big piece. For example, when there is some kind of major incident, the hard facts dominate the front page, but page 2 and 3 will cover individual stories of those affected, peripheral stories, joined to or within the orbit of the main story. What is the response of the government to this incident? What incidents like this have occurred in the past? What do celebrities think about this incident, and what do the public think of what they think, and so on? As the days wear on, the soft news pieces become more and more tenuous, only linked by the thinnest thread of relevance, until finally the story has run its course and the process begins again. In a local paper, however, everything is an irrelevance. The main stories don't have satellites, because they themselves would not even qualify as a peripheral story on a national level. Most stories in local newspapers are exercises in weaving narratives from scraps in an attempt to elevate the mundane and the banal into something almost worth reading. Sometimes, however, even in the tiny, underpopulated corner of the universe, a comet flashes by, a celestial body so large that not only would it make national news, but would change how we think about what is and isn't possible. Then the story becomes too big for even the national papers, because they live in fear of printing anything that might turn out to be misleading or a hoax. These stories have to find other outlets. This story, Arthur's story, is one of those. I first met Arthur Shirk in October of 2015. I'd turned up at his small, terraced house with the intention of interviewing him about his dog, a dog which had apparently been accepted to compete at the prestigious dog show Crufts, a feat which would automatically elevate the talented tail-wagger to the status of single biggest celebrity ever to come out of the town of Wentfield in its entire long and tedious history. The first thing I noticed upon arriving at Arthur's home, however, was the man's worryingly excitable demeanour. He seemed positively ecstatic at the prospect of being able to talk to me, like a prisoner being told moments before he was due at the gallows that he was to be freed on account of there being a national shortage of rope. The second thing I noticed was the conspicuous lack of a dog. Rushing forward before I had even entered the house, he grasped my hands in his own and shook both of them furiously, as if a single conventional handshake would not be sufficient. "Oh, hello, hello!" he exclaimed, pumping my hands jerkily. "I'm so glad you're here, so glad. You'll see in a moment. Please, come inside, come inside." As he said this, he turned and opened the door into the tiny house, as I wondered what in God's name he was going to surprise me with in place of the clearly fictional dog. As a personal interest piece, Arthur's house in and of itself could have been a double-page feature. A few steps inside revealed him to be dealing with the twin compulsions of being an obsessive hoarder, whilst also being meticulously neat. I had visited the homes of hoarders before. Usually they were foul-smelling places, the entire dwelling swirling with a noxious mixture of mould, dust and dampness. In most, the actual living area was a cramped corner amongst the constructed nest of squalor. Magazines and junk mail dating back decades, yellowing and dried by central heating, would be found stuffed into every crevice, whilst pile upon pile of junk and ephemera was assembled around, covering every possible piece of floor space. In one house I had visited as a rookie reporter, the hoarder, terrified of giving anything away or losing it, had kept for posterity an entire shelf full of mason jars in which he stored every piece of effluence ever to have escaped his body. Row upon row of yellow-brown bottles filled with all manner of filth. As you can imagine, the single and helplessly overwhelmed pine air freshener he had hung from the light bulb did little to help with the smell. Happily, this was not the case with Arthur, and though he had the same enormous piles of rubbish and junk crowding every corner of his room, the piles were arranged in an orderly and pin-neat manner, with each pile being so close to exactly the same height as the others that I suspected a spirit level might have been used to ensure they were the same. The experience of walking into Arthur's back room, then, was like strolling through a miniature city. Skyscrapers made up of notebooks and magazines, clustered together in well-ordered rows, whilst the paths between them, narrow, intersecting corridors like streets, constructed with a level of care that would make a town planner happy, were made up of old suitcases, wooden boxes, and storage files full of plastic toys, hand towels, napkins, and cutlery. As your eyes fell upon each section, you saw a tiny new obsession, a new need to collect and conserve. The space behind one chair contained hundreds upon hundreds of coat hangers, whilst the curtain that covered the back patio window was covered from floor to ceiling with thousands of clothes pegs. I tiptoed cautiously through this garden of detritus, the flotsam and jetsam of modern life, careful not to disturb any of the piles, and followed Arthur's direction to a seat on the left-hand side of the room. The small alcove that Arthur had carved for himself amongst his collection consisted of 2 chairs. One was an incongruously ornate thing that looked for all the world like a throne, whilst in contrast, the other, positioned on the far side of a small table, was a simple wooden folding chair. On the table between us was a kettle, 2 cups, and a beautiful Victorian teapot. Before doing anything else, Arthur poured us both a cup and then sat back on his side of the table as if he were preparing to interview me. Finally, after a long sigh, he spoke with visible relief. "I'm so glad you came," he said, still without revealing why exactly he had contacted the newspaper. Clearly, he felt he had something to share, though having seen the inside of his house, I had to assume that sharing wasn't exactly something he was good at. "I'm sorry about the dog story," he said, with what seemed like genuine sorrow. "I actually did have a real talented dog once. Mummy was going to put her forward for Crufts, but you know how these things are, she just never found the time." As he said this, he gestured to a space behind me, and, turning, I saw a small, framed photograph of a woman in her mid-50s with white straggly hair, beaming into the camera and holding an equally white Yorkshire Terrier in her arms. This, I assumed, was Mummy. On her right cheek, the woman had a distinctive scar the shape of a lemon, which, if I had not known better, I would have said was a bite mark that could easily have been blamed upon the apparently talented, but clearly not quite a tame, terrier. For me, it was only okay for a grown man to use the word mummy if he was talking about Egyptology, and any man in his 40s who still referred to his own mother as mummy set alarm bells ringing in a very Norman Bates kind of way. No sooner had my backside hit the chair than I was already thinking of ways to get out of there. "Okay, Arthur. Unfortunately, I am a rather busy man, so if you wouldn't mind telling me why you asked me here today and why you felt it necessary to lie to us," I began. As soon as I said this, I regretted it. The phrasing was a little bit too harsh, too pointed, and too teacher-like. It sounded as if I were scolding Arthur like a naughty schoolboy for not having done his homework. Arthur visibly recoiled. I'm sorry, I didn't think you'd come. If I told you what I really wanted to talk about, you wouldn't have come, and I need to tell someone." For the first time, I began to feel slightly uneasy about this appointment and just how eager Arthur seemed to bring me there. I considered for a moment how it may have been a mistake not to tell anyone where I was going when I left this afternoon. Still, Arthur was a small-built and far from athletic man. I reasoned that if there was any trouble, I would probably be able to overpower him. Probably. Leaning forward, Arthur poured himself another cup of tea before finally announcing, I wanted to talk about honey. Though honey was definitely the starting point for Arthur's story and played a central role in it, to say that is all he wanted to talk about is highly misleading. At this point, the reader might be asking why, if Arthur's story is so fascinating, it hasn't adorned the cover of the major national newspapers. Surely the blood-dipped red tops would love this kind of shock and horror tabloid stuff? The answer, quite frankly, is partly due to the incredulity of those publications, their unwillingness to believe me, or by extension Arthur, or to print anything that might prove to be libelous. It is also partly due to a matter of style. The frank listing of the facts one finds in newspapers provides none of the nuance, sense of atmosphere, or impact when recounting events. I chose this model, a true story in the guise of fiction, because it will not only allow Arthur's story to be told without fear of censure, but it will also allow me to give some sense of my own feelings on the matter, and to tell my own tangential story as well. It also helps me to document things that I know to be true, but still can't quite believe. To begin, however, it might be best to hand it over to Arthur. The thing about honey that people don't take into account is how different types of bees produce different types and qualities of honey, especially depending upon what they have been eating. There are hundreds of varieties, sometimes with subtle differences and sometimes with massive differences, so big that the two types don't taste anything alike. For example, if you ever taste a spoonful of good high-grade pine honey, it's got a really rich, earthy flavour, sort of a base of wood behind the sweetness that really lifts it. If you tried floral honey straight after that, honey that tastes almost perfumed, the two things are completely different. You'd think they were entirely different substances. That's not even mentioning the fact that different flowers in different regions can make things taste different. That the time of year can sometimes affect the consistency and colour of the honey. It absolutely baffles me how people can nip to Tesco's or Asda and just pick up honey, like it's just a generic one-size-fits-all product, like buying Coca-Cola or sugar cubes. It's insane. He said this with a wide gesticulation of the arms, which suggested that perhaps that label should be applied a little closer to home. Honey is a serious business. In some countries, you can buy mad honey that sends folks into a state like being drunk or high on drugs. In other places, the honey from particular bees is so expensive that it can literally be considered liquid gold. That's what Mummy always used to call it anyway. Saying this, he glanced lovingly over my shoulder at the framed photograph and smiled. Then, reaching into his pocket, produced another photograph of the same woman and laid it on the table between us. "That's my Mummy," he said flatly. "Have a look at the photograph. Really look at it. I want you to remember her face." I lifted the slightly crumpled photograph and looked again at the straggly white hair, blue eyes, and distinctive scar, searching the image for any further significance, before gently placing it back onto the table and beckoning Arthur to continue. Mummy loved honey. Her secret, you see, was that she knew. She knew that the type of bee and where they got their pollen from affected the flavour of the honey. When you see most beekeepers, they have their little wooden hives and then the bees go off wherever to get their pollen. What Mummy did was put these big glass sheets up around our garden. It was mad. It looked like the whole garden was just one massive greenhouse, and I guess, in a way, it was. Because what she did then was surround the hives with extremely specific types of plants, hundreds of them, from all over the world. She was a brilliant gardener as well as my Mummy. Honestly, anything she touched would just bloom, like a natural talent, as if it was in her fingers or something. Having the glass up stopped the bees from going anywhere. Not that they cared, they had all the pollen they could ever want in that one garden, and from all those different varieties. That mix, those influences from loads of different plants all going into the pot, was the secret ingredient. That and the type of bees. You see, having these specific types of plants was part of it, but the other part was having a mix of bee species. To start with, the different types kept to their own hives, but after a while, they interbred, and you started to get these hybrids. Special bees on a special diet. You were always going to get special honey. I sank back in my chair, realizing, or so I thought, that this was going to be a story about his sadly departed mother's special brand of honey, all hopes of anything exciting fading into oblivion as he began to drone on about country fates and rosettes she had won. I realized as he was talking that I was inadvertently tuning him out, already drafting a copy in my head about Wentfield's own prize-winning honeymaker, a short piece that would probably be the star attraction of page 18, and be glanced at momentarily by those who used it to line litter trays all over the village. It was only when Arthur used the phrase, "Britain's best honey," that I snapped back into the room. "Wait, is that official?" I asked, sensing that such an award could push the story into the single-figure pages closer to the cover. I mean, did she actually win an award or something? "Oh yeah," said Arthur, seemingly surprised that I hadn't kept up with the twists and turns of the latest honey-based news. "She was quite famous around here for a while. She was even on the cover of the Sainsbury's Food magazine, and she was on Northwest Tonight. I've still got the video of it somewhere around here." This last statement I didn't doubt for a second. So, she officially made the best honey in Britain, I double-checked, starting to feel glad that I had made the trip. "Well, technically the bees made the honey, but yeah." Arthur trailed off, and for the first time in the conversation seemed to lose the enthusiasm that had poured out of him since he had met me at his front door a half an hour earlier. He stared off into the distance, and seemed for a moment to become emotional, as if choking back tears. After a pause, he apologized and resumed his story. "I'm sorry," he muttered in a low voice. "It's just that if it hadn't been for that stupid award, then none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have met Eli and—" He trailed off. Sitting back in my chair, I reached into my jacket and for the first time took out my notebook and pen, ready to note down Arthur's words. I signalled, as gently as I could, for him to go on, and after a minute, during which he wiped his eyes with his palms in a way that reminded me of a child and cleared his throat, he quietly and cautiously continued. "We were at a big farmer's market. Mummy had a stall, and at the front she'd put these banners she'd made about her award. People came and bought bottles off us, and some people just came to taste it. Mummy had put a few open jars at the front with little squares of bread on toothpicks. The idea was that people could spoon out a little bit of the honey onto the bread and have a taste, like a sample. Now, most people who tried the honey loved it, but then Eli came. I knew he was trouble as soon as I saw him. Something about his eyes. He looked cruel. You know, like someone who would just step over you in the street and not think twice. He clearly had money, because he was dressed all posh in this nice black suit, but I don't know, there was just something about him. Anyway, whereas everyone else would just come up and take a little piece of bread and try the honey, he came over and just stood there, staring at the banner. Not saying anything, just standing there. He waited until everybody else had walked off and then he came over. Mummy was really nice to him, the way she was with everyone. "Would you like to try a sample, sir?" she said, and went to pass him one of the toothpicks, but instead he just looked her right in the eye and then, I'll never forget it, he just picked up a whole jar and stuck 2 fingers into it, his index and his middle finger. Then he just ladled out a massive glob of the stuff and let it slide off the end of his fingers into his mouth like a little golden waterfall. We were both so taken aback we didn't even say anything. Then, once most of it had spilled off, he put the fingers into his mouth and without taking his eyes off us, just sucked them clean. It was such a small thing, but it was horrible. There was real malice in it. Then he just opened his hand and let the bottle fall. It smashed all over the floor, and it wasn't an accident either. He meant for us to see him do it. Then he just took a card out of his pocket and put it on the paste table between us. He said, "Best honey in Britain? I think not." Then he just tapped on the card with those same fingers he'd just pulled out of his mouth. I remember noticing that they were still wet and sticky. "If I were you, I'd remove that claim before it comes back to hurt you." Then he just turned and wandered off. "Was he a competitor?" I asked, surprised by the slightly sinister turn the conversation had taken. "Well," said Arthur, the smile long gone from his lips and seemingly now lost forever. "That's the thing. We looked him up later, from the card that he left, but the stuff we read was weird. Weird, I echoed, like a parrot. Weird how? I felt myself becoming genuinely intrigued. Well, he began. Eli Suter sold something called black honey. According to what we could find, this stuff was legendary and had some really odd stuff linked to it. Sensing that I was again about to repeat and prompt, Arthur held up a palm to stop me and indicated that he would tell me in his own time. According to this report we read, Eli had a similar setup to my mummy in that he didn't like his bees roaming. The thing is, his bees didn't mix either. Apparently, he had these weird glass beehives where every bee would be put into its own little honeycomb cell that sealed at one end and had a tiny opening at the other. Rather than letting them fly around, he kept them in these tiny little glass prisons and fed them each individually on God knows what. I mean, I know they're only bees, but still, it's cruel. Anyway, this is all rumour, because you never actually see Eli's hives. They're kept under these thick black sheets, like the kind of thing you put over a budgie's cage to convince it that it's nighttime. Now, you'd think that would be really bad for the bees, because they never get the sunlight, but apparently... He paused here and swallowed hard. Apparently, the honey that comes out, it's black, and, well, it's sort of like magic. I closed my notebook. For a while there, this had sounded like an intriguing story, but Arthur had just crossed the line. I had listened to enough crackpots in my time to know that it was all going to be downhill from here. Magic? I said, the naked derision dripping from the ends of each syllable. Well, yeah, Arthur answered, though I didn't find that out until after. After what? I asked, mentally trying to plan my escape from the conversation and route back to the office. After Mummy disappeared, he half whispered. I reopened my notebook. About a week after the farmer's market, Mummy got a postcard. It was totally black on the front, but on the back, someone had written, "Take it down and renounce, or in 5 days I will be telling the bees." I looked up from my scribblings quizzically and was about to ask before Arthur leapt in to clarify. Telling the bees is an old tradition. Basically, if ever there's a death, or a marriage, or a birth in the household, you need to literally go to the hive and tell the bees about it. If the bees aren't informed or allowed to go into mourning, then it's really bad luck. Sometimes it means they'll leave the hive, or they won't produce honey anymore. It sounds strange, but you can look it up. It's a real thing. I know some superstitious beekeepers who still do it today. I made a note to check this tradition later and tried to clarify the contents of the postcard. Oh, well, Arthur began when I pressed him as to what it meant. It was clearly a threat. Pretty much, stop saying you have the best honey or I'll be telling the bees about you. It's a threat to someone's life. Again, Arthur turned from the conversation to stare into the middle distance. At the time, he said, swallowing hard and, I thought, holding back tears. We took it as a joke. I mean, we knew it was Eli, but, what was he going to do? Arthur fixed his eyes on something I couldn't see, as if watching the entire scenario play out in thin air before him. For a moment, it seemed that he had drifted off, that the room had fallen away, and he had wandered into his own mind. Over and over, almost under his breath, he muttered. What was he going to do? What was he going to do? I coughed loudly, and eventually he snapped out of it, his eyes seeming to refocus as if he had just been woken from a deep sleep or a hypnotic trance. When Mummy went missing, I took that card to the police. At first I thought they'd laugh at me, that they'd think it mad, that some jealous beekeeper could be a threat, but after about half an hour sitting in a waiting room, one of the policemen led me into a small interview room and asked me to sit down. For a second I thought they were going to accuse me of something, but instead, this policeman, Terry his name was, he pulls out his folder and shows me photographs of all these women, and next to the cards, almost exactly the same as the one Mummy had got. Terry said Eli had been a suspect for ages and that they were planning an operation to raid his farm in the next few days. If the card I had given them came back with his fingerprint on it or any other distinguishing mark, then they could bring the raid forward. When I asked Terry what he thought had happened to these women, he sort of dodged the question, but what he did say made my blood go cold. He said that the honey was something to do with black magic, that one small jar of the stuff Eli produced could sell for upwards of £10,000 because there were some lunatics out there who believed that it made them immortal, that as long as they ate enough of the stuff, they would never die or could never be killed or whatever. Terry said, "These kinds of credentials don't come cheap. There has to be some kind of sinister element. There always is with these people. It can't be a coincidence that 12 women that we know of have gone missing, and all of them have received a card from what we assume to be the same man." I thought about Mummy, and for a second I let all sorts of horrible scenarios flash through my mind. When the card came back, it was found to have a single large thumbprint in the centre, a print that belonged to Eli Suter. Within an hour, the police were at Eli's door. I accompanied them to the property, in the hope, they said, that I might be reunited with Mummy, though of course I knew they also thought I might be needed to identify her. As it turned out, the police found neither Eli nor any women or evidence of them at the property. My heart sank, but somehow, in some way, I knew that somewhere on that property I would find my Mummy. So a few hours later, after the police had dropped me off at home with apologies and promised to keep me informed, I went back. It was dusk by the time I arrived at the farm. It didn't take me long to vault the fence and even less time to bust the lock. I walked around the farmhouse cautiously, listening all the while for any signs of life, voices or movement, anything that might give me a clue as to where she was. All I heard was silence, and from outside, the faint, low humming of bees. Looking out into the garden, I saw the hives. Each was around 4 feet tall and had the appearance of a small black igloo, a half globe draped with thick black cloth. I don't mind telling you that in the half-light they looked mightily eerie, like rotten teeth jutting out from the surface of the lawn. I looked about me, knowing that if I was caught there I was likely going to spend the rest of my days behind bars, and that wasn't even considering what might happen if Eli caught me there. Slowly, turning the key, I slid back the glass pane of the patio door and crept outside. Quietly, still listening out for any sound beyond the buzzing coming from the hives, I tiptoed slowly towards them. In the back of my mind, I was already forming horrible images of what might be under the black cloths, images of women bound and gagged, or worse, dead, and rotting beneath the swarm before my eyes. Finally, I reached the first hive, gripped the fabric draped over the top, and with a single wrenching movement, pulled the damned thing off. Arthur paused, leaving as he did a chasm of time between this statement and the expected revelation, the explanation of what lay below. Rather than speaking immediately, however, Arthur reached down to a space below his seat and pulled out a small leather-bound book, which, as he opened it, was revealed to be a photo album. I took the photos on my phone. I had them blown up later and printed. The people who developed them thought I was an artist, that I'd done them as some sort of display piece or project. Can you imagine? Arthur tried to smile, but the momentary raising of his lips only succeeded in producing a horrible, pained expression, somewhere between a grimace and a plea. He handed the album to me. As I flipped through the images, I felt the muscles in my jaw slacken as my mouth hung involuntarily open. Arthur, meanwhile, continued. The glass hive stuff was true. Every one of them was in its own little cell, everyone producing whatever it was they made, but... He was no longer talking to me, but to the naked air between us, seemingly to a space a few feet above my head upon which his eyes were fixed. Not that I paid much attention. My own eyes were riveted to the page, to the images, score upon score of images of the things Arthur had found. We thought telling the bees was a normal threat, like he'd hurt you or kill you, so he'd have to tell the bees about it afterwards. But I never expected this. Nobody could have expected this. He was right. From the pages of the album, faces peered out at me, faces of women screaming in agony, their hair fallen in twisted knots across their foreheads and cheeks, their arms clawing ever forwards against the glass walls of their prisons, their chests and backs naked and yet warped as they spilled into the swollen thorax, 4 insectile legs jutting out, 2 from either side and jammed awkwardly against the sides of their cells. Each tiny body was a hideous amalgam that looked like some crudely stitched together sideshow attraction, like the mermaids formed from the top half of a monkey and the bottom of a fish sewn together to fashion some hideous hybrid, half human, half bee. But these were not fakes. Judging by the scale, each tiny insect was around 3 inches long. The hind portion, like that of some enormous hornet, was black and white, striped and bulbous with a prodigious curved sting at the end, whilst the front quarters were those of human beings, writhing in the agony of despair. I stared at Arthur. These aren't real. I mean, they're not them. They can't be real. How can someone do that to someone? How? It's not. Arthur shifted his gaze from the vision he was observing and fixed his eyes on mine. Then, slowly, he leaned across and flipped the page of the album. In the same way that Eli had on the card bearing his name, Arthur tapped on the page. What I saw was another of these hideous creatures, an abomination, neither insect nor primate, but some forged-together monstrosity. In this photo, the creature pushed itself upward awkwardly on its hands, the weight of its behind seeming to drag it ever backward. As I looked closer, however, at the tiny face raised towards the camera, I saw the strands of knotted white hair and the scar high on the cheek. Mummy. He did it, Arthur hissed quietly. I don't know how or who he had helped him, but somehow he did this to them. From some other unseen corner, Arthur produced a box of safety matches. The box was around twice the size of a normal matchbox, but in all other aspects was just the same. He placed it on the table between us. Then he burst into tears. As his shoulders rose and fell, as the tears streamed from his eyes, a deep, wounded wailing sound rose from somewhere deep within him. I didn't know, he cried. I swear I didn't know. I thought I was helping them, putting them out of their misery. I looked again at the box, then back at Arthur, who was cradling his head in his hands. It took me hours, he spat, tears and spittle mixing and flying out on the table. I took them all out, every single one, and smashed them with a hammer. I crushed them because I thought it would help. From inside the box, weak scratching sounds could be heard, as if tiny legs were scraping against the cardboard. I thought it would kill them, but they'd all tasted it, all eaten bits of that black honey. They couldn't die. They couldn't. But I hit them, all of them, and I crushed them, swatted them like you would a fly. I left them there, just squirming and writhing and broken. Still, the scratching came from the box, louder now, as something within shifted and moved. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know, he wailed. I rose to my feet, eager to get out, to be as far away from Arthur, this house and that box as it was possible to be. I pushed back the chair, spilling a stack of old newspapers as I did, Arthur still sobbing, as from the box a tiny, high-pitched buzzing could be heard escaping. I turned and stumbled toward the door, Arthur still screaming his mantra behind me. I didn't know! I swear I didn't know! Those words have stayed with me. I heard them in my head long after I'd escaped that house and sprinted down the street. More often than those, however, I hear repeated the tiny, whispered reply. A reply merged with a humming buzz, so high-pitched it was barely audible, spoken as if through water. A voice that, though my back was turned, I know was not Arthur's, and that I know came from inside that box. A voice deep in unending pain that somehow, wincing as it spoke, still repeated, I forgive you, Arthur. Mummy forgives you. In 2018, Eli Suter was arrested in Spain for the attempted abduction of a young woman. When the farmhouse he was renting was raided, strange objects were found in his garden. These objects were never thoroughly examined, as someone, allegedly one of the officers involved in the raid, saw fit to set fire to them. The area is now sealed off, though local reports tell of strange humming noises and tiny voices crying out from the ashes. Amongst the documents recovered from the farmhouse was a birth certificate bearing the name Eli Suter. This, however, was judged to be a fake, for if it were genuine, it would make Eli over 170 years old. I never saw Arthur again, but I did send him a letter earlier this year asking for permission to publish his story. He sent me a short note in return, alongside a tiny matchbox that he claimed would provide evidence if any were needed. I never opened the box. Instead, I threw it into the lake by Fuller's Wood, hoping and praying as I did that whatever was inside was already dead. This has been The Bees, a short, scary story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.